I'm just kind of hanging out, having a chill evening, open up my email inbox to find this note. Hello, Faith. My name is Maria, and I'm on the Trust and Safety team here at Patreon. I want to let you know that your creator page has been removed for violating our community guidelines on hate speech. You recently sincerely recited the 14 words on a podcast. At Patreon, we believe in freedom of speech and promoting diverse viewpoints. We want to create a platform that empowers creators to share and debate ideas. That said, we do not support exclusionary ideologies. Is that so, Patreon? Because if you ask me, you banning me is kind of an exclusionary ideology. And as for the 14 words, nothing about them is exclusionary whatsoever. It doesn't say we support one group but not the other. They all have to go. These words in and of themselves are not hate speech. This is a simple statement of survival, something that is a natural instinct for all groups and people. And that, in fact, if you were to replace the word white in that sentence with black, Chinese, Aboriginal, Jewish, any sort of color, ethnicity, creed, race, etc., that just about any other identity politics obsessed group would adopt this slogan for themselves, that it is only seen as hate speech or seen as any sort of inflammatory phrase when white people use it.
Although we often associate the concept of language as social control with the author George Orwell, the use of weaponized verbiage may be better attributed to Chairman Mao during his Cultural Revolution. Here, the introduction of certain magical words, whose use or misuse mark someone as right-thinking or counter-revolutionary, were employed to bend society to the desired end via normal functioning social interactions. The efficacy of this strategy is obvious. It's one thing to fight the secret police, quite another to fight the disapprobation of your friends and neighbors over the words you use every day. As such, conformity may be obtained with only a very limited exertion of the state apparatus. While far from the totalitarian nature of Maoist China, many in the contemporary West have noticed a similar phenomenon forming in our own era's progressive cultural revolutionaries. The injection of specific words and cliches into the discourse to reframe the conversation and hinder dissent has been a recognized element of political correctness for well on 3 decades now. But far from a minor irritation, these words persist in our language, and despite their users' ability to understand their origin or even their meaning, they are invariably controlling the direction of our culture. People often comment how difficult it is to get progressives into a conversation. Very few people who claim to understand progressive ideas ever want to talk about them with critics. However, we are in constant dialogue with progressive ideas every time we encounter these types of words in the media we consume or in the casual conversations we have with friends, family, and acquaintances who have absorbed the terminology through cultural osmosis. I have spoken much about the culture war in discourse, and what I think is needed next is an answer and a methodology for fighting these concepts in casual conversations. Conversations that might be entirely unpolitical and with people who have entirely unpolitical motives. We need an understanding of how these terms work inside our own discourse and how we can subvert their influence. A defense against the dark arts of language manipulation, and a guide to magical words and how to fight them. I'm returning to my Magical Word series this month in light of recent drama concerning the alt-right, and in particular the controversy surrounding the bloggers associated with the blog The Alternative Hypothesis. Now already I've recorded one video on the Alternative Hypothesis, and the drama that surrounded their change in opinion concerning the concept of white nationalism and ethno-nationalism generally, but I thought some additional thoughts were really required to isolate a lot of the lessons we might learn from this set of events. In my previous video, I focused on the radical uncertainty that comes in most predictive or even descriptive studies when they concern things inside of the social sciences. which of course all of our factual analysis of social interaction really rely on, outside of course of what we get from tradition and classical wisdom. However, I touched briefly on another problem with the alternative hypothesis sudden change of heart. And this was the problem of inconsistency in intellectual approach, paired with the fact that most of the symbolism used by the alt-right movement, and indeed most of the political parties associated with white nationalism, is fundamentally toxic. This adds an additional bite inside the problem of inconsistency within the messaging held by the leaders of any given movement. It's bad enough being the follower of a political movement that can't keep on message or continuously changes its point of view on the turn of a dime, but when that political movement carries with it such stigma that you could lose your job and family for publicly professing it, an inconsistent message is deadly. But of course, this problem with the alt-hype got me thinking about other conversations I've had with people both on the left and the right, and other things that I've seen over the past year. And in particular, I'm thinking of the symbolism, and the words that the alt-right uses to describe itself, the ways it uses to identify who's really simpatico with their cause, who are the people that are really on the in, and who are the people who are on the out. This has been important for fringe movements generally to distinguish themselves from the mainstream, or the normies, as the alt-right tends to call them. And the alt-right has become very well known by a few very, very distinctive phrases, symbols, and self-descriptions they've used for themselves and other people in the movement. Now, I'll try to give a more exhaustive list of the words that the alt-right uses to describe themselves in order to contrast their position from the normal conservatives or even from the liberals and progressives. But there is an elephant in the room, of course. One particular set of symbols that the alt-right has consistently used as a litmus test for their own cause. And that is, of course, the 14 words. Usually referred to as the 14 words, or sometimes used in a numeric acronym as 1488. Now, once again, if you haven't heard these words, I'll repeat them here as well as print them on the screen. They read simply as follows, quote, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children," end quote. These words have served more or less as a mission statement for white nationalists, identitarians, and the alt-right generally, but more than that, they really have been a litmus test, a way of showing that the person uttering them is indeed aligned with the alt-right, if not explicitly affiliated with them. What immediately strikes one about the 14 words is that they are, well, on their face value, totally innocuous. Who doesn't believe this about their own race or any race for that matter? They're not controversial statements in the least. Nevertheless, this was the shibboleth that the alt-right picked, the phrase its leaders chose to characterize their movement and to construct the boundaries between themselves and mainstream conservatives. Now, it's important to note here that the 14 words in this construction, as I have written them, are essentially a quote coined by a white nationalist leader named David Lane, who is the founding member of an organization called The Order, which was classified as a terrorist organization, Lane himself being indicted and convicted of assisting a terrorist assassination and sentenced to 190 years in prison. The irony not lost by the alt-right is that the 14 words authored by David Lane are probably the least controversial things the man ever did, and certainly one of his most humane statements. The juxtaposition of a more or less innocuous statement next to a character who has incredible historical baggage and an incredibly evil past shows a little too clearly the intention behind the 14-word phrase itself, to essentially cover up a very radical and perhaps very, very aggressive movement behind a language that seems more or less anodyne. However, the original intent of the 14 words and their reemergence inside the alt-right to act as a sort of shibboleth, a signal of in-group affiliation, is not the topic of this video. Rather, it's the reaction to these words that has been spearheaded by the left in the last 2 years. Needless to say, the word's origin, the word's author, makes the actual phrase of the 14 words impossible to defend by any public figure who's confronted by them, regardless of what the words actually mean in plain English. This has offered the left the perfect opportunity once they discovered that the 14 words were a shibboleth for the alt-right. They could simply stigmatize the utterance of these words and use the utterance of the words to isolate people they thought were too closely affiliated with the alt-right or the alt-right's way of thinking. A good way to search and destroy reactionaries that go against the grain. And if my assessment of the situation is correct, the 14 words has been doing way more work for the left than it has been for the alt-right over the last year and a half. And just to illustrate, I'm thinking back to a conversation that I had with the Bronx blogger. Now, for a while, about 4 months ago, I was talking to the Bronx blogger, in particular about his attitudes towards the alt-right. The Bronx blogger, being a rather hardline progressive, believed that the alt-right and alt-fascists, in his word, needed to be deplatformed. Of course, this statement by Bronx blogger immediately, in my mind, begged the question, well, what is a fascist? And I grilled him on the topic, saying, well, do you think Roaming Millennial is a fascist? Do you think Lawrence Southern is a fascist? Do you think Faith Goldie is a fascist? And after a while talking to Bronx blogger, I realized that he had drawn the line simply around whether they had ever uttered a few buzzwords, most prominently among them, the 14 words. Faith Goldie was a fascist, and we knew she was a fascist because at one point she had said the 14 words. Lauren Southern probably wasn't a fascist because she had never said the 14 words. And when I pointed out that I didn't really see that much difference between Lauren Southern and Faith Goldie, regardless of the specific quotes they made in reference to fringe figures from 3 decades ago, he just shrugged and said, well, they said the words, that categorizes them as part of that group. And of course, I pushed it further. I said, oh, well, let's translate the 14 words. Let's say you just want to ensure that your ethnic group survives, and you believe that your ethnic group is Europeans. And of course, he didn't have as much of a problem with that and didn't think it would make anyone a fascist. If they said the 14-word phrase, that meant they were a fascist, regardless of the fact that a translation of that phrase, carrying the exact same meaning, would not similarly indict someone's character or label them as a fascist. And I remember thinking that this really was the ne plus ultra of the magical word concept that I've been describing inside this series. A word or a set of words that, when uttered, immediately identify the person as part of the evil outgroup, but that a translation in meaning, a translation away from the specific sounds that create the emotional reaction, don't carry the same consequences. I mean, if we were to be purely intellectual, if we were to be purely Socratic in our approach to these things, if we translate the same concepts into different sounds, different words that come out of our mouths, there really shouldn't be any difference in how society deals with those two phrases. But of course, when we use magical words and the words themselves confer the virtue or the profanity, then of course it's a different matter altogether. It's not supposed to be an intellectual game, it's supposed to be an emotional one. It is supposed to trigger our disgust reflex. And that really gets one to think. Signaling aside, why were the 14 words so important? Why were any of the symbols used by the alt-right important? If their objectives were more or less, well, unobjectionable to mainstream people, if the meaning behind their words was so unobjectionable, then why did this group choose some of the most radical and alienating language available to describe themselves and what they were attempting to accomplish? Were all these radical descriptions and goals even necessary at the end of the day? A fair question, since I think that it's obvious that when everything is said and done, the radical left has been much more intelligent with how it's approached language than the radical right has been. I think that the foundation of this difference, at least in the realm of language, is that they have realized that there is a certain amount of malleability in language, but not an infinite amount. They've then been able to use that malleability to their advantage, positioning their concepts in the firmest possible ground with the most moderate sounding words available at any given time, and then slowly shifting as the context changed. There is a great deal of malleability when it comes to human language, and I'm not so sure that this is something that the right can ignore for very much longer. When we're using language, we have to be sure that what we're doing, the words we're using, the words that we're choosing, are the most appropriate and the most powerful for the purposes we have selected. Once we can see that the meaning is communicated, we can then select how to present it in the best way possible. If the audience will permit me a visual aid at this point, we can imagine the universe of human languages being something like a box. And I know I've used this analogy before for a variety of other descriptions of linguistics and political persuasion. But for now, it'll be useful to push the point further. Of course, if we were to construct this box as we've shown it here, we could also divide it in two insofar as political disagreements occurred. There would be a space for left-wing discourse and a space for right-wing discourse, and different words and concepts and descriptors would pervade in each one. Things that would set each side aside, things that they wanted to talk about, language that would be more appropriate for the ends that they were trying to pursue to begin with. And of course, in between where those left and right discourses occurred, there would be political controversy. People would come to the table, they'd reach across the aisle and communicate using whatever shared language they could find over who had the best ideas going forward for the community. This is sort of the normal political back and forth that occurs inside a republic or a democracy or whatever we want to call our system, where public discourse is a large part of deciding what actually gets done. Now, of course, inside this realm of political language, there's another big distinction, probably a more important distinction than the difference between left and right discourse, and that is the distinction between acceptable language and unacceptable language, the things that you just can't say or do or assert in polite company. This is sort of the edge of the Overton window, if you will. And this constrains our language in a really hard way. If people hear you saying things like this, expressing phrases that seem like they come from this side of the linguistic political dimension, you could face loss of job, disownment from various friends, and other very, very negative consequences. It's very difficult to cross this line. Now, at once it might be tempting to believe that this distinction between unacceptable language and acceptable language is more or less symmetric, that they're essentially guarding rails off the extreme end, both on the left and the right. But in our current political mode, and for our political mode for the last 60 years, really the rails have only been in effect on the right. There is essentially no radical political leftist language that could really be a permanent threat to your career and to your friends and your family, at least if you live in any mainstream American community in the 21st century. You're just not going to lose your job for being a communist, or even promoting radical communism like Stalinism. However, the same is not true for the right, with many of its more radical features being so deeply stigmatized that any allusion of support to them will immediately land you in hot water. In this way, you could see this red line of political unacceptability really cutting through exclusively the right end of our sphere of political language. In many ways, this has led to a right-wing, or at least a mainstream right political movement that has been much weaker culturally than its left-wing equivalent. It's been constrained. It hasn't had the ability to grow freely in both directions. In many ways, its imagination has been limited linguistically, and it's essentially consigned to the play it safe kind of right-wing thought that we see in most mainstream political publications of the Republican variety, of your National Review variety. There is this temptation to always play it safe, to be the people who are reasonable, who are responsible, who aren't going to deal in radical new ideas, because you really can't deal with radical ideas on the right without running the risk of being stigmatized. And of course, to add insult to injury, or injury to insult, the mainstream right is also hampered by the fact that this line of unacceptable language is not in fact static, but moving, and indeed moving to the left constantly. So not only is the modern mainstream right-winger cut off from possible radical thoughts he might have, he is also cut off from his predecessor of 50 or 60 years ago, who in his own imagination must be considered some type of horrible reactionary that must be shunned as a bigot, or must be thinking things that are totally unacceptable. To repeat any of the attitudes concerning, say, homosexuality that were popularly discussed in right-wing intellectual circles 30 or 40 years ago would immediately get you fired from any Silicon Valley job, or really any corporate America job that has a modern HR department. That type of conservative thought just is not part of polite conversation anymore. And the left knows this, and they realize that they can use this to their advantage. As the Overton window shifts left linguistically, there'll be a smaller and smaller linguistic space for the right to operate inside of. And so, to be a person dedicated to polite right-wing ideas, to be a person dedicated to mainstream republicanism, mainstream conservatism, is to be a person essentially resigned to occupy a constrained and hobbled intellectual space, if nothing radically changes. Now, of course, I think the very natural reaction on the alt-right was to take the opposite approach, especially in the age of the internet, in the age of totally uncensored comments, in the age of anonymous communication with no social repercussion. This was certainly a possibility. One could go to the furthest reaches of the internet and stake out language and a political discourse that would totally subvert every expectation polite society held up. In essence, the alt-right community could be seen as a small colony, living way out beyond the red line of politically unacceptable language. Their discourse would essentially exist as a discourse apart from the mainstream, as something that was truly outside acceptability. And of course, for as long as the alt-right remained totally online, or small enough to escape notice by the mainstream, this model seemed like it could work indefinitely. But this was never going to be the case. As the movement grew, as the movement gained more prominence, as people who followed these ideas wanted to carry them forth into the real world, the alt-right realized it can no longer hide behind anonymity, that it at some point had to come out and speak in the public square. And this is where its problems began, because the public square still operated under the same rules of acceptable language. And under these rules, the left had every ability to censor, deplatform, and stigmatize people when they spoke up in public, at very little cost to themselves. I don't really think that the alt-right has hurt the left. It's given them more or less what they want, a villain to hate, someone to motivate their central core supporters, and moreover, an enemy that they would never actually have to fight, an enemy that they never actually would have to answer. The alt-right could rage all day long about the double standards this and the hypocrisy that. The left would never have to sit in a room and actually entertain their ideas. To borrow a military analogy, it's almost as if the left had a huge set of long-distance guns or howitzers that were extremely deadly but couldn't really be used at short range due to their very devastating impact. Once an enemy appeared far enough away, essentially outside the red line of politically unacceptable language, they could pummel them at a distance and suffer virtually no losses themselves, enjoying the limelight while hurling the rotten tomato at the already despised heretics. Not an ideal situation for the alt-right at all. Okay, but what is the solution between these two bad options? Well, I think the solution lies just in this realization that from the outset, the model that we're looking at, this little box, this little description of how political discourse is operating, is not actually describing ideas, but is describing language, words, sounds, and symbols. These are not the actual concepts. These are symbols that represent the concepts. And the relationship between the symbol and the actual idea itself is malleable. It's not infinitely malleable, but it is malleable. It can be modified, it can be stretched. People can tactically reconfigure the symbols that correspond to their messages to achieve the desired effect. In order for the social stigma, in order for the deplatforming, in order for the ostracization that the left uses to work, there needs to be a certain distance in language and in symbols between their target and themselves. Stigmatization only works symbolically, only if people can actually see that the person is doing something that is stigmatized. Once it moves into the conceptual realm, it's too abstract for people to really understand. If there is no or little symbolic difference, if there's no or little linguistic difference between the in-group and the out-group, no successful stigmatization or deplatforming effort will ever occur. And herein lies the weakness of the leftist position. If the ideas of the right, and perhaps even radical ideas from the right, can be placed in language, amenable or close to the language that the leftist coalition uses or has used in the past, any attempt to stigmatize or deplatform these ideas will be useless. Of course, there's limitations to this tactic. One can't use all left-wing words without, in essence, carrying forward some left-wing meaning. Language is not, after all, infinitely malleable, but a certain amount of wiggle room is definitely available. If we were to look on this map of political discourse and we were to ask ourselves what would be the ideal place to have a new right-wing linguistic framework emerge, we would have to reject both the strategies of the alt-right and also of the mainstream right. On the one hand, we couldn't have a discourse that was constantly being sandwiched between a moving Overton window and the political controversies of the day, such that any left-wing movement would grant the left political victories and any right-wing movement would essentially result in social stigmatization. At the same time, the idea of the alt-right to flaunt the conventions does not work anywhere outside a few isolated internet communities. To me, the only option, the best option, is to try to subvert current leftist political language, to reclaim it and use it against them. The ideal cultural sphere for a new right-wing community's discourse would be in sidestepping the political conversations of our time altogether and trying to peel off current or old leftist language for use in describing reactionary or traditionalist political aims. A flanking motion for which any attempt to move the Overton window further and further to the left will result essentially on the left ostracizing and stigmatizing former allies, resulting at last with a self-cannibalizing progressive order. But is this kind of linguistic flanking motion even possible? Is it achievable to essentially recast right-wing ideas using language popular with the left-wing or progressive movements in past eras? Is it possible to communicate even radically right-wing ideas this way? Obviously, the two dangers are in repeating the mistakes of either the mainstream conservative movement or the alt-right, in forging a language that either implicitly concedes the point to the left from the outset or is consumed by pure signaling. If we could for a minute just examine both the language of the mainstream right and also the alt-right and see how it really has fallen down. In contrast, we might look at how leftist language works and see how it's bolstered their movement and carried their banner far further than it probably would have warranted by its own merits. But first, let's examine the mainstream right language. The mainstream right language immediately is struck by the fact that it's confining and totally unimaginative. If you listen to people from the National Review, it's stodgy, it sounds like it comes from the previous century. There's no way to express a radical idea. Everything seems about as exciting as tax policy. The other problem it has is that it's overly apologetic. Has there ever been a conservative whose primary focus didn't implicitly seem to be losing with good grace? And of course, I understand I'm Christian. Charity is a virtue. But the apologetic nature of the modern right is not something that really indicates that the people who are following it really believe what they mean. It's all water and no fire. And this leads to another common mistake on the mainstream right, which is mistaking manner with principle. The idea is sometimes associated with people like Burke that the role of the conservative is to smooth over change rather than to provide a new direction for society that is not progressive. And ultimately, in total, these qualities lead to a movement that is easy to bleed out slowly, to perform a Mott and Bailey tactic on, and to convince to participate in a pantomime of a cultural debate that results in its own destruction. Again, nothing about this sounds fun. By contrast, I think the alt-right's language, while perhaps fun and outrageous, doesn't really ever accomplish what it wants to. It's hyperbolic. It alienates outsiders. And as with many radical movements, it mistakes purity with principle. I literally have heard people from the alt-right, albeit probably less educated ones, claim that purity spiraling was a feature and not a bug of their particular brand, completely misunderstanding how contests of purity can utterly devastate effective and operational political communities. And of course, as a result of all their signaling and all their radical language, they remain, as ever, easy to totally vilify and to deplatform. By contrast, if you ever take a look at leftist political language, even radical leftist political language, you'll see that it's utopian, it's exciting, it has promise for the future. It's moralistic when it's extreme, meaning that every time there is an extreme element, it is cloaked in a moral mission and in a vision to remake humanity and a vision to uplift humanity. And many times when it actually does in embody radicalism, it's vague. If you look at somebody like Noam Chomsky, a radical from the left, how much does he ever talk about his ideal anarcho-communist utopia? It really never comes up. The radicalism for the future is never discussed in explicit terms because really no radical movement really thrives on that. And again, as a result of all of these qualities, the left remains attractive when on the offensive and fundamentally hard to nail down when it's being criticized. It's very, very tough on the defensive because it never seems to really be anything, at least when it's being questioned. I think in light of this, we can look at 14 different labels that the right wing currently uses, 7 on the mainstream right and 7 on the alt-right, and see how we might be able to split the difference and come up with better words, better organizing principles for some kind of dissident right-wing movement to use when constructing an actual alternative to progressive society. Again, this list isn't exhaustive. This is just the things that I immediately thought of when calling to mind words that both the mainstream right and the alternative right have used to describe themselves. And you see in this list a very distinct contrast, and I think implicitly a symmetrical set of mistakes. Let's start first with a hallmark of the conservative movement that's really carried over to modern liberalists. That is their opposition to identity politics. Now, of course, for people who have been listening to conservative thought for quite a while, who also end up listening to people like Sargon of Akkad or any of the liberalists, they'll recognize a lot of these rages against identity politics as originating really from the conservative movement. Since the 80s and the Reagan coalition, buttressed by publications like National Review, conservative intellectuals have been talking about identity politics and how identity politics are poisoning our discourse, and how the hyphenation of the American identity into African American or Cuban American or white American is fundamentally dividing our patriotism. And in some sense, all of these things are true. The use of identity politics does coarsen the discourse. It's designed to do that. It's designed to create an us versus them mentality and to avoid any kind of open dialectic. Moreover, the use of hyphens in front of American does inherently decrease from our natural sense of patriotism. Nevertheless, I think the conservative rage against identity politics is entirely misguided because it's based on a simplification and really a lie. At the end of the day, all politics is identity politics. All political affiliations are identity driven. Of course, there are random philosophers and deep thinkers that can isolate their own identity and their own sense of ego from the thought process they're undertaking to solve a problem. But those people are very rare. You'll find them mainly among academics, and even in modern academia, you won't find that many people that separate their political identity from their own thought process about politics. For most people, politics is about identity. It's about how we conceptualize our interests and who has those interests at heart. And the rage against identity politics in the abstract was rightly lampooned by the left. It's easy to see through the dishonesty on the conservative side, because really what the conservatives wanted to say was that they opposed the specific identities being used by the left and wanted to go into an all-encompassing nationalistic identity for America, specifically an all-encompassing national identity that was led by Anglo-white Americans, even though it might comprise other races and cultures in the periphery. And of course, the left called this out for what it was, and they were right. And everyone who honestly came to the table in dialogue saw that they were implicitly right, and that this wasn't actually a description of what people from the conservative side and now the liberalist side really want. Now, by contrast, the alt-right, to counter-signal against this mistake, went whole hog on the other direction and decided to just explicitly call themselves white nationalists, white identitarians. Forget opposition to identity politics, we are running identity politics full bore. And you see this even in the ideas of white nationalists like David Lane, albeit not from this current generation of alt-righters. He expressed this devotion to identity politics that made him oppose things that he saw as universalist in any way. He saw Christianity and any notion of a dialectic that all people and all races could participate in as fundamentally dishonest. But of course, I think this alternative approach, in addition to being heavily stigmatized and firmly in the area of discourse that is unacceptable in a public sense, The error really is that it concedes too much of the aspirational dimension of human ideology to the left. Humans have always aspired to some kind of universal principle or universal ethical system that could comprise all of humanity. This has long been the dream of the West in particular, both in its Christian and pre-Christian forms. And I don't think walking away from the notion of a universal ethic, a universal language, and a universal dialectic is something that really makes sense in the era of mass communications and globalization. I think this essentially concedes most of the global game to the left from the very start and consigns any kind of opposition to the progressive movement to being some kind of strange form of particularism that can only go on in very, very specific localities. Instead, I think people should focus on commending a certain kind of identity, an identity based around community and common cultural practice. A community based on societies where we can share things with our neighbors, regardless if that community is a highly diverse one or one that is more or less racially homogenous. The dark secret of the left in general, especially the urban left, is that they can't really ever create the type of closely knit, diverse society in the places where they're strong, even though they endlessly talk about it in the abstract. Leftist communities tend to be lower trust. They tend to have, less community in them than ones that are on the right. And this should be front and center in any kind of language the right uses about how it wants to construct identity. And for this reason, I might suggest that the right re-explore an old leftist word called communitarian, essentially refocusing the point of identity back onto the community, back onto the cohesive community that we want to bring forth. This type of thought is simultaneously universalist, but does not necessarily ignore the distinctions that could occur between different peoples. We want to have a closely knit community, and it's really not our job to determine the exact racial admixture of that community. That should be left up to each locality itself to determine. And of course, this does the job of recapturing some territory lost by the left. The left used communitarian a lot in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, but found themselves walking away from it increasingly post-2000 as it became clear that the communitarian and localist angle really wasn't properly describing their power base in the modern world. But at any rate, we can move on to the second word used by traditional conservatives or mainstream conservatives to describe themselves. And that is the tendency for mainstream conservatives to characterize their own work as conservative or Burkean. Now, a brief digression aside, one of the fathers of conservatism in the West was one Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment thinker called Edmund Burke, who in many ways could be seen as contrasting the radicalism of someone like Thomas Paine. Now, Edmund Burke believed that the conservative role was to maintain society and maintain the wisdom of society in a way that the necessary changes brought about by the technological revolution and the Enlightenment wouldn't really hurt them. Essentially, the Burkean concept of conservatism is to hold both the technological progress and the wisdom of the traditions in rein together, to essentially make sure that the goodness isn't being wiped out by the new flashy things. And the quintessential example of this would be the French Revolution, Edmund Burke obviously preferring the American Revolution, which left most of the cultural institutions intact and did not result in the type of bloodbath that occurred during the Reign of Terror. This has led to a conservatism whose purpose has been fundamentally to conserve, to make sure that things maintained in a certain way. The role of the conservative was that of steward, was that of regulator. But I think we've seen a big turning point in the last 20 years, because at this point, it's become obvious to a great many people that a lot of the changes that have been made were not necessary, they were not needed, and implicitly they carried society in a wrong or bad direction. Yet through the process of the passage of time, these changes have become part of the infrastructure of our society. Therefore, any conservation of that society is going to replicate these very mistakes. The Burkean model, in essence, has been broken. We can't simply conserve society and expect the sacred wisdom to carry forward into the future. And I think in reaction to this, the alt-right has fixed for itself a kind of revolutionary attitude, a sort of fascist revolutionary attitude, that what we need to do is we need to tear down the system, complete the historical cycle. We've gone too far to the left, and as we all know, history doesn't move to the right, so what's needed is a sudden and violent correction. Now, I hardly need to reiterate why this is threatening to people and why someone who has this point of view is going to be easily stigmatized by people on the mainstream or normies, so to speak. Nevertheless, I'm always amazed to find alt-righters surprised that their calls for some kind of fascist overturning of the political order that we've had for the last 100 years met with suspicion and derision. And of course, they're certainly thinking that they can ride the same radical chic bandwagon that the left has been on. And I think this comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of how the left evolved its radical chic. The emphasis was always on the aspirational, the theory of the man trying to do good for his society. The left also had built up a distinction between the dreaming academic leftist who talked about radical ideas in the abstract and the dangerous Leninist and Stalinist revolutionaries. People feel safe with radical leftist ideas because the left has made clear that they're going to be introduced very slowly, and the people who talk about radical ideas in this way are only deep thinkers who are not a threat to people who want to live an otherwise bourgeoisie lifestyle. Now, I know that no amount of words is going to build that perception in the minds of popular culture for the right, but I do think some things can be done to make a start on it. Perhaps replacing the explicit calls for revolutionary action or radical action with just saying things like, I consider myself culturally conscious, or open to radical ideas from a variety of perspectives. This contextualizes right-wing radicalism in the same way that left-wing radicalism has been contextualized for the last 80 years, as an intellectual exercise done by people who think about things, who dream big. And after everything is said and done, this is the point of radicalism to begin with. There's really no point talking about the specifics of a revolution in this way, because revolutions are probably far in the future, and at any rate can't be planned. Therefore, the big discussion, the vindictive imaginations of some kind of revolution are ultimately entirely counterproductive to any real political cause. Moving on, another trope of the mainstream right is certainly the values focus, the values-based politics. And although a mainstream right-winger would certainly deny this up and down, there is an implicit notion that human beings and human cultures function like blank slates. Of course, if I had a Buckleyite here, or if I discussed with a mainstream conservative on a live stream, they would deny any affiliation with this blank slate thinking. But it's essentially been part and parcel of their approach to globalization, not to mention many of their foreign policy adventures in the last 15 years. There seems to be this notion, in particular in American conservatism, that American values are infinitely spreadable. Mind you, this is not just the belief in a universalistic principle, or the dream that we can ultimately speak a common moral language worldwide, even though we might have separate cultures. There seems to be born in American conservatism, and therefore implicitly in all Western conservatism, the belief that specific political orders can be brought to bear in a very real and workable way in the contemporary world. I hardly need to go into the failures of this particular ideology in the last few decades, but suffice to say that this has resulted in a counter-reaction against the values focus, and in the spheres of the alt-right, an obsession with certain types of immovable identity based on genetics, based on determination, based on hard cultural features that can't be changed. And I think this really explains the alt-right's obsession with race realism, and has even resulted in a type of racial determinism. I've maintained for a very long time on this channel that there really is nothing necessary about a belief in race realism to achieve any right-wing ends, even radical right-wing ends. And when you really quiz people from the alt-right even on their beliefs in race realism, they say that even if race realism is false, they still would probably believe very much the same things they believe right now. The reason why this obsession with racial determinism has played such a large part in the construction of the alt-right is that it has essentially contrasted a fundamental mistake made by mainstream conservatives over the last 30 or 40 years. I think the way to get around this once more is to return to what we really value and what the strength of the conservative movement really is, namely its ability to construct and maintain communities that last intergenerationally. There might be a focus on things like trust communities, or communities built on a common ethical tradition, or even perhaps the use of the word organic communities, emphasizing the fact that we have to have a certain type of community based on principles, based on a cultural tradition that we probably don't get to build ourselves, and that fundamentally these communities have to grow from something that comes before them, and cannot be engineered the way that most people in the academic left imagine they might be. Now, of course, we may find later from examining sociological data or observational data from another source that communities like this are easier to procure among monoracial groups or perhaps diverse groups. But either way, this is a detail, something that we can determine later on. The first thing that needs to be asserted that can catalyze our opposition to the left is that these communities are organic and are based on ethical principles that are hard and long-lasting and permanent. This, I think, is enough to contrast the position of the right from the left, while simultaneously avoiding the mistakes of brain-dead globalism on the mainstream right and a reactionary over-reliance on determinism of a biological sense that might not even be factually true. I think a closely related trope to the values-focused politics of the mainstream American right also was a type of overemphasis on patriotism and American exceptionalism. Now, right from the start, this was a mistake made by the post-World War II right wing. In the case of the word patriotic, this was something that was really derived and pushed in the wake of a new attempt to integrate disparate groups from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe into the Anglo-American mainstream. The idea behind patriotic was that it was a type of nationalism that wasn't nationalism, a type of nationalism that was not culturally specific. Both the Italian and the WASP could be equally patriotic. Both the Irishman and the Jewish man could be equally patriotic. It did not rely on cultural fixings whatsoever, and it was something that we really associated with these purely abstract symbols: the Constitution, the American flag, the national anthem. Of course, these created sort of an implicit American culture, but it was never so pointed. And this sort of birthed the notion of American exceptionalism. Now, of course, right off the bat, the word American exceptionalism comes from leftist jargon in the 60s and 70s describing this culture of patriotism that emerged on the American mainstream right. But of course, in typical conservative fashion, the right wing of America essentially adopted the term that was meant to be originally pejorative. America is exceptional. We have this thing called patriotism, this non-nationalistic nationalism that can be universally spread across cultures. And of course, you see how this trope immediately led to the former one in terms of making massive political mistakes. Now, of course, the foundation of both of these concepts is fundamentally flawed. While it is true that America does have some amount of principles when it comes to the principles of the founding fathers, these ideas are not decultured. They're not infinitely malleable. They can't be exported to all cultures. And if you go back to the original thought of the founding fathers, they most certainly wanted to have these ideas be carried forth by a very specific Protestant Anglo culture. There was some debate over whether Catholics and other Europeans could be integrated into this WASP culture, for lack of a better word, but nonetheless, almost all founding fathers believed that the experiment of the American identity was being done in the context of a specific Anglo-American culture. In contrast, the alt-right has been fascinated, essentially with describing large fantastic scenarios in which they tear apart the unity of the United States and create little ethno-states, as people like Richard Spencer are wont to call them. Now, once again, in addition to scaring normies and scaring the mainstream, this concept has a number of problems. The first one being that it is fundamentally opposed to the larger American political project since the end of the Civil War, which has always been to unify the states and unify the various cultures into one common political identity. The alt-right has essentially hitched its cart to the losing side of an argument that's been going on and set itself in opposition to the largest military force this world has ever known. It is also very easy to spin horror stories that come from any kind of ethnic partition of the United States. Now, while I've speculated that there might be some ways of forming or giving an ethno-state to radical right-wing groups that would be peaceful, a no-hold-bars partition of a multicultural society like the one we currently occupy could, in my opinion, never be done peacefully if there was not some overarching mitigating force governing the entire affair. The only way to realistically imagine something like this happening is a Balkan-style land grab in which other racial groups will be seen as liabilities in each pseudo-government's attempt to make claims to trillion-dollar real estate. Needless to say, this is particularly terrifying for people of a multiracial background, and it's not hard to see why this is generally a non-starter. Even if the desire is entirely hypothetical and meant with a certain dose of irony or dreamy aspiration. Instead, I think the obvious alternative to this is to go back to the roots of America, as opposed to making a desire for some kind of separate peace, in opposition to the dreams of the Founding Fathers and the mission of America post-Civil War. There needs to be a re-emphasis on localism. The left itself has said that it likes localism, that it likes people acting locally. They've used this word in their own radical communities, and it's perfectly available for people of a right-wing persuasion to start using it as well. It also dovetails very nicely with the Jeffersonian utopia imagined by the Founding Fathers of strong yeoman farmers forging their own way in a world where they needed very little connection to a larger political order. And given the direction that technology is going, this may become a possibility yet again. It may be possible to radically decentralize. Furthermore, the right could also appropriate the leftist term indigenous self-determination to emphasize that we are in favor of small cultures' ability to resist a larger order that wants to assimilate them and incorporate them into really what amounts to a cold, calculating economic system. Again, this is something that the left has fought for, that the left considers perfectly utopian, and adopting this language would go a long way in furthering the right-wing cause, and making it very, very hard for it to be stigmatized. And I think by talking about this, we implicitly have to discuss a further trope, another central idea and identity label used very prominently on the mainstream right. Indeed, it has become a term of identification for the new internet community growing up around bloggers or vloggers like Sargon of Akkad and V. Monroe, and that is classically liberal, liberalism, or the ideal of a libertarian reality. Now, without even going into the leftist critiques of these comments, what is immediately wrong with liberalism? Well, people who watch my channel know that I have a number of videos on this, but this is of course the quite simple proposition that you cannot build a liberal or a libertarian society in a cultural vacuum. The Founding Fathers knew this, Burke knew this, any Enlightenment thinker worth his salt knew this, and of course pre-Enlightenment Europeans knew this so deeply that to propose the opposite would have been seen as, well, frankly, insanity. And of course, because of this, the alt-right has countersignaled, making it a focus of their movement to be anti-degenerate, as they say, or to borrow a more popular internet phrase in our modern era, to be against the cucks, to be anti-cuckold, labeling their opponents on the mainstream right as being cucks, indicating that by participating in the system as it is, e.g. liberalism, they're essentially undermining the culture that has led to their own position being prominent. They're being hoodwinked in the most humiliating way imaginable. Now, of course, I've mentioned that the word cuck is a little bit crude. It's thrown around on the internet so casually that anytime anyone proposes a fair standard, a universal application of justice, a belief in a standard of liberty that transcends racial boundaries, they're immediately labeled as a cuck. Heck, most of the foundational principles of Christian ethics themselves, insofar as they promote charity, understanding, and turning the other cheek, have been labeled as cuck-like behavior. And it's gotten to the point where Christian authors of a perfectly conservative and orthodox nature have written articles defending the idea of being a cuck. I think missing the point that the more intelligent people on the alt-right were trying to make, but nonetheless a proper reaction to the hyperbolic nature of how the term is thrown around on the internet today. I think the obvious solution is to again see how the left has dealt with these problems. Instead of focusing endlessly on the distinction between classically liberal, libertarian values and those of the people who want to purge the culture of its degenerate aspects, we should be emphasizing the realism that's brought to the table by the reactionary point of view, and how this realism can be incorporated to achieve potentially classically liberal ends. Instead of saying anti-cuckold or anti-degenerate, people should be talking about being social realists and wanting to incorporate traditional wisdom into the procurement of goods in modern society, into the procurement of human thriving in modern society. After all, it is traditional wisdom. Anyone from the pre-Enlightenment would have been able to tell you that you cannot have an advanced cultural order inside a moral vacuum. And anyone from the Enlightenment would be able to tell you that you can't have liberalism inside a cultural vacuum. Discussing this in terms of realism and wisdom is definitely the way to go. It's also a way of turning something that is a trite buzzword, as so many libertarian concepts are, into a path that is introspective, that is considered. that can provide more insight than the really tiresome bromides about small government and non-interference and statements about how what X person does is just their own business. Everyone knows that there's more to life and culture than that. And for this reason, a transition to the language of realism and wisdom is not only necessary, but frankly will be quite refreshing when it happens. Again, closely related are the concepts of pure rationality. Now, anyone who's spent a long time in the libertarian movement knows that reason or rationality is kind of a buzz concept for them. They throw it around a lot. And they do this because libertarians are of the belief that if you have the proper first principles, the libertarian concept falls out almost immediately from that. You see this in movements like objectivism, right on to more open libertarian movements like the kind promoted by the magazine Reason. And once again, we have the same type of signaling towards the Enlightenment values that you saw in the previous tropes. And of course, these have all the same attendant problems. Here, though, in more of a political sense, what oftentimes isn't realized is that as demographics change in the West and other places, the realities of reason will also change. I remember attending a libertarian conference about a year ago and hearing constantly how we had nothing to worry about from immigration. All we had to worry about was the triumph of free speech and liberal values inside a multicultural community. And from this, I just asked the speaker, based on the polling data, we see a declining support for free speech among college students and among new immigrants. Reason alone is not going to give them these values. That's a total misunderstanding of the original Enlightenment concept to begin with. I think in contrast to this really misguided faith people put in this concept of enlightened reason in a democratic or republican society, that a lot of people on the alt-right move to, again, the hyperbolic labels of authoritarian, of explicit anti-liberalism. You'll have people openly supporting monarchy, openly supporting the idea, of course, in the abstract, of a government's ability to limit degenerate thought and limit degenerate speech, of being against the entire idea of liberalism and openness in the cultural sphere. All of this is designed to countersignal the mistakes of the people who are obsessed with rationalism and the Enlightenment. But in the process of performing this countersignaling, I think a lot of the people that talk this way have missed the great irony of their position. Liberalism, the concept of liberalism, and the concept of rational dialogue with no holds barred is the only thing that's keeping them platformed in the very limited capacity that they enjoy right now. If we were to totally remove the concepts of Enlightenment liberalism from society, it is the right that would be immediately subjected to China or Germany style encroachments on free speech and communication of ideas. In other words, the right wing has picked one hell of a time to discover their anti-liberal side, namely the exact time where they benefit the most from liberal policies. Instead, I think the natural alternative is to focus really on pragmatism. People who listen to this channel know I've said this many times, but I'll say it again. I don't typically support any given political system, namely because I think different political systems have different utilities at any given time. I like thinking of myself as a political skeptic. Rome at one time might have needed a republican government, and at another time when it was constitutionally different, have required an authoritarian or imperial one. What mattered was the cultural and ethical tradition it was carrying forward in its mission. The politics existed to serve that. The right wing at this time is in no position to propose radically different political orders to take root in the mainstream. They are a fringe movement. They are a counterculture. And as such, they need to start acting like it. They need to embrace the pragmatism and skepticism that the left had in the 60s and 70s, and that the left has walked away from in the last 5 years. This is the proper path to explore potentially radical alternatives, while at the same time asserting, I would hope, in our own liberal right to have these conversations in the modern order. Being very specific about details in political belief is costly. Being open to new ideas, being considerate, being thoughtful is not. It's open. And it makes people more interested in what you have to say at the end of the day. Now, of course, I wanted to follow this particular statement up with one of the more irritating tropes in modern conservative thinking, and this is the anti-ideology, the anti-ideological nature of conservatism generally. For a long time, the conservative movement saw itself as a default position, as a type of politics for people who don't want to care about politics. Sort of a leave us alone, we don't want to be labeled idea of what conservatism meant and what opposition to progressivism meant. Now, I think quite obviously this is a mistake because it doesn't leave room in any movement for true believers, for people who want to dedicate their lives to promoting some kind of ideology. And in the world that we currently live in, where voice matters so much more than calls to walk away or leave the society that's making those choices, this last trope embraced by modern conservatism has been a particularly fatal one. I notice by contrast the reactionary movements online taking the track of counter-signaling constantly. And it's even gotten to the point, as I said previously, where people are owning the practice of purity spiraling, where they're literally encouraging people to get into contests about who is the most pure, who has the most right-wing beliefs possible, regardless of whether they're practical, regardless of whether they're even true. I don't think I need to go into the reasons why purity spirals are natural deaths to all movements. To my mind, it's pretty obvious to anyone who's seen it actually occur, and it's doing nothing for the contemporary alt-right movement, certainly. But between these two extremes, I think what really people need to go back to is just the ability to plainly speak about our beliefs, to be radically honest about what we believe in, to have a certain amount of ideological ownership. Now, originally, I think this was the great strength of the alt-right. People who cared about the particularities of culture, be it European, American, white, or otherwise, finally came out and just said it. But I think this is purity spiral to the extent that now the alt-right is obsessing about minor phenotypical differences in genetics. Now, certainly, if you deeply care about phenotypical or genotypical expression in a certain group of people, honesty compels you to assert this. And I think it will be fundamentally dishonest to say otherwise. But to what degree do people in the alt-right movement really do predominantly care about race and genetics? Certainly in the case of the alt-hype, I recently learned that a person I thought cared ultimately about genes, really didn't care about them at all. And in my experience, this is a very, very common phenomenon. People are using race as a signaling marker. And I think self-honesty compels us to examine our core principles and understand where they really begin. And at this video's end, I think we finally returned to the principles that have motivated this series, of the general rules that we want to take to language, that we always want to be sincere, not sarcastic, that we don't want to lock ourselves out or in from a conversation, as both the alt-right and the mainstream right do respectively. We want to speak truth with prudence, and we also want to constantly build understanding, and that understanding has to come from honesty. As I've said before, I believe that tradition and the right wing generally has truth on its side, and eventually truth will win out. It behooves us to be honest, and more importantly, to be honest with ourselves about what we actually believe. I think we can use language to make other people understand the meaning without getting caught up into stigma games that really only rely on the symbols being used to express those eternal and timeless truths. And here we have to combine a certain amount of cleverness and a certain amount of honesty. Now, I don't know if I've done a good job here. I certainly haven't done a perfect one. And these 14 examples are just the beginning. I hope that this series, and if not this series, future live streams, will be able to discuss more details. But at any rate, I hope this video has given you something to think about, and I'll see you on the next Magical Words episode. Have a good evening.